Over the last few weeks, there's obviously we've gone through both the side of, I guess, the users of social media who are engaging with the news. We've looked, of course, at the. In fact, I've got a slide for that too. We've looked at the way that people have made social media their own in engaging with the news, and of course, we've looked more at the way that journalists and news organizations are using social media, and particularly also social media metrics. So we've kind of seen the industry side as well as the user side of this now. Now, this week, we'll look at a particularly interesting, I think, blend of those two kinds of logic, social media logic and journalistic logic, in the form of live blogs. And you might wonder why we're spending an entire week on live blogs, which are a very specific format of journalism, but I think by the end, hopefully, it will become clearer how much this is really one of the kind of key attempts to blend these different logics together to create a new format, I guess, for journalism that does something kind of interesting and unique, and provides kind of a social media experience almost for users without being social media as such. So that's really what we'll talk about today. And then, of course, we'll go on further. We've had a week on the whole challenge of fake news already, and mis and disinformation and whatever else is involved in this. But we'll go on from here to another specific, I guess, innovation in journalism or journalism-related practices, and that's fact-checking as a distinct practice that has evolved really over the last 5 years or so. Certainly very strongly evolved since some of the great upsets, I guess, in politics and the role that mis and disinformation have been playing in this as well. Things like the vote on Brexit, things like the election of Donald Trump, and everything that's followed afterwards as well. So that's where we'll go next. So really this week and next week are about some of the key new innovations in journalism that have happened over the last few years. All right, so live blogs. I'm wondering how many of you have seen live blogs. I'm guessing most people have encountered the format. I see a few people nodding. You may have just seen them, kind of taken them for granted in some ways, but it's really worth, I think, spending a bit of time with live blogs to really talk through, well, what are they and what do they represent, I guess, in terms of their role in day-to-day journalism as well. So this is actually a good time to talk about this, because particularly with the midterm elections in the US that have just happened, and counting, of course, is still continuing, live blogs have played quite an important role in all of this. And with any kind of major ongoing news event, we've seen live blogs emerge. So this is an example from the BBC News website, and this is, I think, a screenshot I took a couple of days ago. That's kind of the top of a live blog, essentially. You see there very prominently, it says live. You see, in fact, how many people are viewing this page at the time, 67,000 people. So that's a large audience, obviously, for journalism as well. And you see there a little sidebar with the summary, and then, of course, the live reporting, and a whole bunch of kind of updates if you scroll down further that you see. Plus the other sidebar that links to related stories that have something else to do with this live blog, that might be sort of the longer form journalistic pieces that have been written over the course that this live blog has been going, and that you can read in full basically by clicking on them as well. So that's the BBC. This is what it looks like on The Guardian. It's always a bit difficult to take screenshots of live blogs because you really just see the top of them, obviously, if you do that. But again, that's what The Guardian looks like. Again, you've got that sort of label there that says live. You have kind of a little timeline at the top there that kind of gives you the most recent updates. And then, of course, you scroll down and you see further updates as well. This is also, by the way, kind of pointing out the journalists who are involved in this. And as you see there, there's a person who's there now, another person who was there earlier. So in many ways, these formats kind of have a rolling roster of journalists that come in and out, and in fact will sometimes very publicly hand over to each other on the blog as well and say, well, I'm out now, I've done my whatever shift of 4 or 6 hours or whatever, I'm now handing over to another journalist who's taking this up now. So the journalist becomes much more visible in some ways in all of this as well. A little bit closer to home, this is the SRF live blog. So it's not just the big kind of American and British outlets that are doing this, but really around the world now this is happening. So SRF looks like this, a little bit more restrained in terms of the format perhaps, but essentially very similar sort of things. Here you see kind of a summary of the key updates at the top, and then again as you scroll down you'll see more and more updates of course coming through as well. And that's what it looks like at the Tagesschau in Germany. So again, you know, there's a kind of a marker here. They always use those plus signs basically to say this is a live blog as opposed to just a regular article. And again, you know, as you scroll down, you see these different updates. So I kind of wanted to show you this just in this form, just to see that there are some similarities in the format, I guess. To put them side by side and perhaps to see a little bit more of what they look like. This is basically those same pages, but with a bit more space to show what they look like. And again, you see here with the BBC, there's multiple kind of updates clearly divided. The Guardian has this block at the top that basically has the, as it says there, what we know so far, and then further updates further down. This is the SRF one. So again, there's sort of a timeline there and updates and updates and updates. And here's the Tagesschau, which again does something quite similar. And here actually, and this is not just what they do, but what really a lot of them are doing, you can see actually embedded tweets, for instance, as well. So that's also quite a common feature. In fact, I will just go, and hopefully this will work, to some of the live sites now as well. Yes, thank you, skip verification. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like as we scroll, this is the live blog as it is. Of course, this is now a few days old, so they've ended this particular live blog and then moved over to another one. But as we scroll, as you see there, we see these kind of shortish pieces that update us, and you know, individual kind of updates on particular stories, perhaps from around the country on particular races. This is actually still relatively restrained in some ways, because it's largely, as you scroll down here at the moment, it's just updates from their own kind of journalists, and then the links out to further information. Often in live blogs, and I'll go to some of the others in a minute as well, you'll see much more embedded content from elsewhere. The BBC, maybe because it's a public broadcaster, maybe because it's concerned about what it includes in its live blog, doesn't include that much outside content here. That's actually a little bit unusual. But you also see these sorts of updates here, awaiting Biden's speech. So this is kind of journalism in progress, kind of saying what's going on, what are we waiting for now, what are the next steps that will happen. So that's what the BBC format is. Let's actually have a look at the Guardian, for instance, by comparison, because while live blogs are clearly a distinct format, the way that the different news outlets interpret them and implement them, of course, on their sites tends to differ based on how they operate, what their internal rules are, for instance, for including outside content and so on. The Guardian, of course, being in some ways essentially a non-profit, also includes these kinds of calls for support for the Guardian. Here we're seeing, for instance, the Guardian does include embeds from Twitter. This is a tweet, obviously, here about something that went wrong in the election. Then again, you've got lots of updates from their journalists. Very often you get these sort of progress updates, just bullet points of what's been going on, so that a reader who comes to this or comes back to this can quickly see, well, what's the latest that's going on here. Again, links out to further articles that have been written. Let's see if there's anything else interesting that pops up. And then they divide it up, in this case, into pages. Some of them just have these very long kind of scrolling lists of things, but in the Guardian's page, they do divide it up into separate pages. And then let's have a look at SRF. There we go. So again, kind of updates. Infographics from time to time as well, that's quite common as well. In this case, obviously, particularly with an election, that's a very common thing to do, and it keeps going. a bunch here, for instance, okay, they're embedding their own video content from time to time as well, little snippets from their correspondence reporting in, interpretation of what it all means, for instance, and so on. And then again, you can, in their case, they'll just have these buttons that say show more, and again, you keep going and scrolling. So they're also a little bit restrained in what they include from the outside world. But, and there again, this is just their own content, of course. And here again, that's their own content. So fairly restrained in their case. And then finally, let's have a look at Tagesschau as well. So here again, we see fairly short snippets of updates in this case. We see, again, an embedded post from Twitter here. Updates from their correspondence. Again, that's quite common, of course, particularly in these sorts of cases. Lots of text, actually, in this case. Again, a correspondent update, more correspondence, another Twitter piece. And this is, in fact, kind of interesting because ultimately it links to another media outlet, not really a rival media outlet, obviously, in this case, because it's Good Morning America and it's not a direct rival for a German public broadcaster. But it's interesting that in this case there is actually kind of an acknowledgement of other journalistic outlets as well. And here too, Jim Acosta, who is a CNN moderator, a political journalist. So this is a German public broadcaster basically embedding some snippets from a CNN anchor as well, and in fact the front page of the New York Post and so on. So this is again quite unusual in many ways. Normally news outlets don't really refer that much to each other in their reporting, but in fact here you see just a CNN snippet basically as well. This is much more common to do this kind of cross-referencing of other people's work in Liveblogs as well, in order to keep the story going and to have the latest information embedded as well. So that's what that looks like. So that's kind of really the fundamental format, I guess, of Liveblogs. And again, if you've followed them in some way, then you've seen these sorts of cases. Each of these four actually were in some ways a little bit restrained in what they embedded, and that may be a more recent trend that there are greater concerns about the truthfulness perhaps of outside content that might be brought in. Perhaps also in this particular case, there are simply a lot of reporters that these news organizations have sent to the midterms, so they can rely more on their own network rather than on others. If you've got really significant breaking news events, unforeseen breaking news events, you might see a lot more content being embedded from the outside world, from other news organizations, or even from the general public who just happen to be on the scene for an event. So in that case, you might see quite a bit more of that kind of outside content as well. So in many ways, this really is a new format for journalism. This is quite an unusual format if you're just used to the standard kind of articles that outlets normally provide. And in some ways, it responds also to the challenge of social media, of course. What we've seen over the last few weeks, what I've told you about over the last few weeks, is of course that we've seen lots of individual journalists who've gone on social media, have created their own accounts, become their own brands, even sometimes become more recognizable brands than even their organizations, the organizations that they work for. And that's been maybe good for them, maybe not so good for the news organization. It's not even necessarily been all that great for them as journalists, because it also means that they're now in a space that's outside of the news organization itself, and where they can be challenged, where they can be criticized, where they can be attacked, where they can be harassed. So this kind of uncommon ground where audiences and journalists really rub up against each other on Twitter, on Facebook, on other social media platforms, can be quite a difficult space to navigate for journalists as well, of course, because they are no longer isolated from all of that feedback in the way that they are on their own websites. We've also seen, of course, at the organization level that news organizations have created their online spaces, their online accounts. They've created their pages on Facebook, they've created their accounts on Twitter and so on. But also the more they use, of course, social media, the more perhaps readers don't necessarily navigate all the way through back to their own websites, because they just see the updates and the story snippets that circulate on Facebook and Twitter, and maybe that's enough to get an overview of what's going on in the world. So in some ways, the difficulty has been for news outlets, the more they've been on social media, to actually bring their readers back to where they normally are on their own platforms, on their own social media platforms, on their own websites, because that's also where they generate the most advertising revenue that ultimately funds journalism. So if people just stick around on social media, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's the other platforms that generate money from advertising. It's not the journalists, it's not the news organizations. The only way for news organizations to have a steady income stream is to bring readers back to their own websites, where they can serve ads, where they can make money from that. So that's been a particular challenge. So in many ways, journalism, news organizations need ways to bring readers back to their own websites for random visits or even for subscriptions, in order to make themselves sustainable. And we've seen, of course, how that can work, particularly from some of the new operators that have entered the market. BuzzFeed News, Huffington Post earlier as well, and a few other platforms that have emerged really to create more sticky formats that do bring readers back to the websites themselves, by having clickbait headlines, by providing running updates as well on their topics. And that's really been a success, as much as anything's been a success in news recently, for drawing audiences to their websites, making money via advertising, but also ultimately drawing audiences away from traditional news outlets. So BuzzFeed for a time has been able to generate quite a large audience by what it does, which is not necessarily quality journalism, of course, but has been very attractive to readers, and has been more successful in that than many conventional news outlets have been. So in some ways, what mainstream and quality journalism has been looking for is new formats that do bring audiences back to their own platforms. And they could do that, obviously, by, yes, going down the clickbait route, and many of them have. Many particularly more tabloid and generic news outlets have published more clickbaity headlines in recent years, and become more sensationalist in order to draw audiences back. But that's not really an option for the quality news outlets like the ones I've shown you there in their live blogs. So the live blog model actually was an alternative to that, another way of trying to solve this problem by creating something that is, in a sense, quality reporting, but is also attractive and sticky for audiences, making them come back, making them spend more time on the site. So in some ways, really, if you look at what we've just seen with these live blogs, these endless kind of scrolling lists of reverse chronological updates, it looks quite social media. It looks like a Twitter feed or a Facebook feed, but it's not social media as such. So it's kind of mimicking the format of social media without being social media. And that's quite a smart way of creating this hybrid, basically, that perhaps attracts audiences who've become so used to social media formats, but still want quality journalism as well. So, and this is from the CEO of the New York Times at the time, who also said, well, really what we want, of course, as publishers is not just people who will be, as he says, super light users, one and done, essentially people who just visit for an article and then never come back. That's not really a sustainable audience, because they might go to the New York Times, but they might also go to BuzzFeed. What you really want is more loyal, truly engaged readers and viewers who are spending real time with content of real quality and relevance. And that's not an easy proposition. So this is kind of the New York Times saying, we don't want to be BuzzFeed. We don't want to just have a whole lot of articles that people go to because they've got clickbait headlines, and they go there, read the article, and then leave again and perhaps never come back. What we want is quality readers who engage with quality content. But that's really the challenge. That's kind of the challenge that live blogging is addressing as well. So going through a few of the sort of the key quotes in this sort of in this sort of context, Alfred Hermida and his colleagues have pointed out that it's always in the initial stages of new communications technologies that these sort of innovative forms of production, of content production, of news production emerge. And that's, I think, what we're seeing with live blogging as well. And in some ways, this, yes, it's drawing on the logic of social media, the opportunity, and really the logic of not just social media, but the web overall, as opposed to print and other legacy forms of publishing. So publishing evolving news on a rolling basis instead of presenting complete stories. That's been quite a jump for journalism, because so much of journalism has been crafting an article and putting it out there, whether it was in print initially or even in broadcast as well, crafting the package and putting it out there, and then finally online as well. That's really the model that they follow, the paradigm that they follow. This is breaking through that and saying, well, actually, why does the article need to be finished before we publish it? Why can't we update the news on a rolling basis on websites that can be so easily edited, modified, updated, and so on? And live blogs really are that, many of these developments that we've seen over the last few years, that's sort of where they condense into something tangible as a new form of digital journalism. And so, the other aspect of this is also, in some ways, it's actually more like a 24-hour cable news kind of broadcast. It's that kind of model, much more so than it is a model that's borrowed from newspapers originally. So obviously, newspapers needed to package up their articles, send them to the printer, and have them printed in time for people to pick them up in the morning or the evening in some cases. That's just what you needed. This is something different that essentially takes a much more broadcast model where, yes, there's always updates coming in, and when they come in, you put them on screen, basically. So, and even in broadcast, that's taken some time for that model to take hold, rather than just have the sort of the nightly news with the finished packages. So it's really, it's not just competing with broadcast, it's really competing with cable news type news broadcast. That's, again, a very specific kind of format. And that means making this a lot more loose and a lot more changeable and unpredictable, of course, as well, which is something our journalists don't frankly like very much. As much as they keep reporting about current events, they like to come to a conclusion and write that up and then put the article out. They don't really like working, flying by the seats of their pants, basically, working in this sort of very undetermined space where it's not really quite clear what even is happening, but you already have to talk about it. So this loose frame, this lack of fixed script that Telskiewicz writes about is, again, something that journalists have struggled with for a very long time. There are still plenty of journalists that essentially struggle with even the cable news format as well, because so often you just have to kind of fill airtime until you know what's actually going on after the initial reports of something that's happened. And so that's then really the logic. These live blogs, well, the ones that you've seen obviously are set up for an event that was predictable, it was already known it would happen, but very often they're then also set up when some breaking news event happens, or something unforeseen occurs, some crisis, some scandal, some catastrophe, some attack or whatever. And that's when they're set up, and they can be set up very quickly, and then they run until the event terminates, or it just is no longer newsworthy. So we've seen, obviously, for instance, with the Russian attack on Ukraine, we've seen immediately that most major news organizations set up live blogs and have continued them day after day, month after month, to update what's going on. When COVID hit as well, pretty much every major news organization around the world set up live blogs that were providing the latest information, and did so on an ongoing basis. I think there was a Guardian live blog on COVID, it might still be around, that basically ran for more than a year straight, day after day, a new live blog that was updating everyone on the latest developments in COVID around the world. So that's the sort of events that also trigger the creation of live blogs. But of course, much smaller events can also do the same. And again, journalists still struggle with that really quite seriously, because it also means putting up information, putting out updates when it's not really quite clear what exactly is going on. Maybe this hasn't been fully vetted, fully verified yet, but it's information that's come to hand. Something seems to be happening. We're not really quite sure what it is yet, but here's the first sort of information that's been coming in. And so often really unvetted, unverified information is put into these live blogs as well, with the appropriate disclaimers often to say, well, not really quite sure yet, this may or may not be true, we're hearing reports, but it's not entirely sure if that's really happening or how to contextualize this. But this is also something that has been that has been a challenge for journalists, because they don't like that kind of uncertainty. They don't want to be shown to be wrong in the end either. But it borrows, and that's obviously why it's called a live blogs, well, it's borrowing much more from news blogging, which has done this much more and has kind of put up these things and then sort of verify and contextualize what's been going on. So that is that has been a challenge, and this is why perhaps in some of the live blogs that we've just seen, there isn't so much of the outside world, the outside content being embedded, unless it is from other verified sources like CNN, because these news organizations, these major news organizations, don't want to be spreading false information, falsehoods that seemed accurate at the time but have turned out not to be. So, as I say, in some ways, a lot of this borrows ultimately a lot from social media formats and from blog formats, obviously, as well. But it also kind of is a twist on these formats. So let's have a bit of a look at some of the kind of key features in this. Usually, not quite always, and I'll get back to that, I think, a bit later, but usually live blogs tend to focus on a single topic or a single event. So the midterm elections, for instance, the war in Ukraine, COVID, political scandals, other events that are happening in the world. And it's not just for politics, of course, but often it's for a single topic or a single event. It's displayed very much like content is displayed on social media in reverse chronological order, so the latest updates at the top. And that is something that over the past, 10, 15, 20 years, I guess by now, we've all as internet users, not just social media users, have become incredibly familiar with, because that's really the default format of so many online platforms as well, that you see the latest updates at the top. So it's taking that approach as well. Of course, they're fairly frequently updated, depending on the story that they're covering. There might be updates every few minutes that are coming through. And they often combine essentially facts, or really factoids, little bits of fact, with a very quick interpretation by the journalists who are running the live blog as well. So saying, okay, we're hearing reports about this. If that's true, then it would mean that that's bad for Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whatever, for instance, in the case of the midterms. Or it might mean that, yes, the Democrats will hang on to the Senate or not. So there's often this kind of very quick kind of contextualizing interpretation that takes place as well as information comes in. It's often done in a very conversational tone, so it's not the kind of authorial voice of the journalist that you would see in news reporting normally, but it's kind of almost making a little bit fun of the process perhaps as well, or just sort of saying, well, okay, we're hearing that, we're not really quite sure yet, we'll let you know more once we get more information. Sometimes there's a little bit of behind the scenes reporting as well, so observing just, okay, someone's going on stage to concede defeat in the election, they look a bit nervous or whatever, so a bit of that kind of almost banter as well, but also letting people in on the backstage essentially of all of this. We've seen with the midterms lots of reports about Donald Trump's bad temper when the Republicans didn't do so well and so on. So this kind of just more, I don't want to say tabloid reporting, but more really behind the scenes reporting on the people rather than on what's going on happens quite a bit as well. And really it is storytelling in some ways as well. Through these updates, these constant updates, you're telling a story as it happens, rather than giving a full report on the thing that has already happened. You're telling it as it's still occurring and as it might still change in many ways. And for journalists, that actually reinstates them also as sense makers. And this is kind of one of the challenges, and we've talked a bit about that in previous weeks. The more news reports were circulating on social media, the more, of course, social media users were also empowered to say, okay, if that's happening, then it means that. and were able to also respond, I guess, to the journalist saying, well, you're not interpreting this right, here's a different take on the same story. In this, because it's now the journalist very much in charge again of the live blog and able to give their own interpretation without anyone coming in and correcting them or giving another version, it's putting the journalists really right front and center again as interpreters of events, as sense makers of events. So that is reinstating, re-elevating, if you like, the journalist as sort of the person who's interpreting and contextualizing things. But as I said, also these live blogs often, and more so than actually we've seen in these examples, embed all sorts of content from the outside world, tweets, images, videos, links, of course, to other news sources as well, and to the organization's own reporting from time to time too. Sometimes, not always, live blogs go as far as having sort of an open feed of comments, of questions from the audience. The journalists often identify their Twitter handles or other ways to contact them, so audience members can kind of respond back to them and say, hey, you're reporting this, but I'm living there, so I can tell you this is actually happening or whatever, and contextualize things. Or people can just ask, well, okay, when do we find out about the results of whatever, the Arizona Senate race or something? So you can kind of ask for information sometimes of the journalist. How much they respond to that, obviously, is very much up to the journalist. Some do that much more than others. But that's in some ways what's kind of broadly similar to what happens on social media. What they maybe do better than social media, and why perhaps they're more attractive to audiences than just following a journalist or a bunch of journalists on Twitter or Facebook and seeing the updates there, is that the format's a little bit more streamlined. So very often, as you've seen from what I've shown you, at the top of the live blogs, you see the summaries of the stories. You get updates when there's new bits of information that have come through. So it's a little bit more user-friendly almost than just having a Twitter feed of the election hashtag, for instance, that's going to be full of everything and informed and uninformed voices. And that's really also, that means that it's just less noisy than social media platforms are, even if they're covering the same kinds of topics. It's, of course, well, I say carefully, hopefully carefully curated by journalists throughout the day, throughout the event. So it's kind of a reduced feed. It's less volume, I guess, ultimately as well than what the social media feed of, I don't know, the midterms 2022 hashtag on Twitter would be. And for our purposes, in the way that I've talked about gatewatching over these weeks, in some ways it's the journalists actually acting as gatewatchers as well. Because what they do is to follow events out in the world, follow also what other journalists and other news organizations are reporting, and picking out from that what they think are the most important updates that they then embed into the live blog itself. So they're gatewatching, they're curating the news, they're sharing the news via the live blog, but they're doing it, of course, not on social media where they can be challenged or where others are doing this as well, but in their own space where they set the rules and they set the format and they can control exactly what that looks like. So they are much more in control than if they did that kind of gatewatching, news curation, news sharing simply via Twitter, Facebook, or any other kind of social media platform. So for them, that's also a benefit. And again, what's really unusual here, and what we've seen a little bit in the examples I've shown you as well, is so often there are links out to other news outlets, to other news organizations as well, and to other sources more broadly as well. So not necessarily just news sources, but background sources, experts, and others as well. That's not something that journalism often does. Particularly commercial journalism doesn't do that very much because it doesn't want you to go to the other competing organizations, of course. It wants you to stay on their own website. Here, though, they do it, and they do it because that's actually improving the value of the live blog itself as the source of all of these links. So this is, again, quite an unusual practice in some ways for mainstream journalism, and that's a way that they've perhaps, again, learned something from social media platforms as well. So the origins of all of this go back some time, it has to be said. For instance, we saw live blogs being set up in 2005 after the terrorist bombings in London, and this is kind of just a very basic version of a live blog. As you see there, you see 1810, 1642, 1630, 1545. So again, reverse chronological updates basically of events as they happened. On the Guardian side, in this case, the BBC did something similar. It's not really quite the sort of format, obviously, that you've just seen in the midterm reporting. So it's a much more simple format, and it was done without really having kind of live blog software already in place, perhaps on the platform. So they were just basically publishing an article and updating it regularly, or as news came to hand with more information. But this was kind of the starting point for some of this, and these sorts of unfortunate and tragic events also led to journalists saying, well, you know, we could do this, but we could do it more systematically, perhaps, whenever, hopefully not terror attacks, but other kind of major events are happening as well. So that has been a kind of a moment that really, you know, created the interest and created the idea that maybe there's a format here that could be explored and developed further. But it really means ultimately that the way that journalism reporting works is changing. So Charlie Beckett says it moves from a linear one-off story to a stream of instant witnessing, often combined with background context and analysis, as well as public interactivity through comments or email. And that's really, I think, a good summary of what live blogs actually are and how they work, what they look like as well. That's stayed the same, even though the formats and the platforms obviously have changed quite a bit over time. And again, Teresa Tereshkiewicz, who's been writing a lot about this, says it's not so much just the individual factoids on the events themselves that are being reported, but it's the reactions, it's the interpretations of the news that are ascribed more value and meaning. So it's the journalistic, but the value in a sense that journalists are adding by doing this is to provide some immediate interpretation, contextualization, background, and so on, which, yes, you can find on social media platforms more generally as well. But of course, you might find very good and very poor takes on what's going on as well, because there's everyone there, not just professional journalists or other experts. So this is in some ways providing a version of social media that is a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more filtered, and hopefully, depending on the quality of the journalists, obviously, provides maybe some more informed takes on what's really happening in the world. So that's the kind of the core selling point, essentially, of live blogs. And it's interesting in a sense as well, and that's again something that's perhaps borrowed from social media. The live bloggers themselves are not necessarily on the scene. They're often very much in the office, following a feed of all sorts of streams, basically, from their own journalists, of course, but also from social media. And they're, as it says, they're pulling everything together into a narrative, but they're doing it from the office. They're normally not on the scene. They have people on the scene, ideally, as we've seen with the embedded kind of correspondence in those election live blogs, for instance. But the live blogger themselves is in the office and coordinating and kind of the spider in the web, pulling it all together. And this is a live blogger for The Guardian who said, well, you have this view that there are lots of other people out there who are your eyes and ears. So it's really relying on others. And in that sense, again, it's not unlike if you're following a social media feed, of course, for a particular event, but it's a much more filtered and much more organized feed in a sense. And then it is filtered and curated into the live blog rather than back out onto social media. So in some ways, and I know I've shown you Andy Carvin and his coverage of the Arab Spring quite a few times before. In some ways, this is a form of live blogging as well. The main difference here is just that he didn't post his kind of curated feed of information on a live blog. He fed it back into social media and became quite visible there. But again, his practices were very much those of a live blogger as well, working from an office in the United States, covering the Arab Spring in Egypt and elsewhere, and yeah, relying on people on the ground to be his eyes and ears, essentially. So in some ways, this is still very much the practice. What's changed is that this is now fed into a website rather than onto back onto the social media platform itself. And this then really also involves the readers. So I kind of like this quote from Matthew Weaver, who said, well, you can say, look, this is out there, we can't verify this, but it's being talked about, it's part of the story. We're letting you in on the workflow of journalists in a way, saying, look, it's out there, help us verify it. And then readers do jump in and say, that's rubbish or that's not true. So it is a more involved approach to the reader, although not quite as involved. And that's what I think why journalists like it as well, as just putting yourself out there in social media platforms themselves. So it's engaging, and it's utilizing the eyes and ears of readers as well, and the background knowledge that readers might have, but it's doing so much more on the terms of the journalist rather than on the terms of the social media platform itself. And that's, I think, why journalists like it. And so we're seeing these things overall. I've folded away here the midterm bit, but this is from a few days ago from the Guardian's front page, and you see there those red ones are all live blogs. So in addition to the live blog or live blogs they had for the midterms themselves, they've got one on the COP27 climate change summit. They've got, of course, their ongoing live blog on the Russia-Ukraine war. They've got a UK politics live blog as well. And if you looked at the different editions, the US edition or the Australian edition or other editions of The Guardian as well, you'd see more live blogs still that might be around domestic politics in other countries and whatever as well. So The Guardian, and this is just one example, The Guardian does a lot of these live blogs day after day after day on different topics and different events. And the same is true for many other major media organizations. Of course, you need to have the staffing, you need to have the support to do it, you need to have the setup to do it as well. But a very large number of the major news organizations are now doing this sort of thing at a very regular basis and can switch on a live blog essentially within minutes of some major event occurring or something happening, something unforeseen happening, basically. And in addition to those event-based or really issue-based live blogs, you also get these sorts of things. That's again from The Guardian. Don't worry so much about the headline about Meta. The point is, this is their business live blog. So throughout the day, every day, there is an ongoing business live blog that they run, which is simply updating on the current stock market trends and business information releases and so on. And you see in the timeline there, so we've got something on Facebook, we've got something on Made.com, something on ITV, Marks and Spencer's, European shares and oil prices, Weatherspoons, and so on. So this is an ongoing rolling update, basically. It's a bit like what you see in really old movies, the sort of ticker tape of stock market results, basically. This is done as a live blog. So a constant update of the key business news, basically, as they're coming through. And they do this every day. And so it lends itself particularly to not just issues and events, but really broad topics, news beats, as they're called, like business and others, where you can just update with events through the day, and where, for instance, people who are whatever, stockbrokers or whatever, people who are in some form following the stock market, following business, will just kind of continue to check in to see what the latest news updates are that are relevant to them, basically. So that's kind of what's going on here. And yeah, if we scroll down, I don't think I turned this into a link, but if you scroll down, you could see these kinds of updates coming through, basically, time after time. And this is another one. This is a sports live blog, basically. This happens to cover cricket, which is probably a sport that you're not particularly familiar with. But what you actually see in this particular case for this cricket match is even play by play, essentially, the updates saying, okay, so and so has taken a wicket, or so and so has reached another milestone in the match, and so on. So throughout the match, basically, you get these updates. And again, The Guardian and others are doing this for major football matches, cricket matches, whatever sport you're interested in, there's probably a live blog out there, basically. And I'm sure we'll see it with the Football World Cup coming up, for instance, as well. So this is again one of those cases where it makes a lot of sense. If you don't happen to be there, if you don't happen to watch it on TV, you can just kind of go there, have that on in the background, and you'll see the updates coming through, basically. All right. So that's all fine for journalists, and perhaps you can see why it's kind of attractive to journalists, because they can do something that's like social media without necessarily exposing themselves to all the challenges of social media that they have as well. So the next question is, well, what do audiences actually do with it? Do audiences like this? How do audiences engage with this? And of course, for audiences, this can be confusing in the first place, because it contains all of this stuff coming through. I mean, in the same way that social media can be confusing, of course, it contains all of this stuff coming through before it's really fully known what it all means, basically. Just individual facts, factoids that are being posted that might or might not turn out to be true, or might not turn out to be important, but just a lot of stuff being pushed through. And there isn't this kind of written through narrative, essentially, that kind of full understanding of what it all means, but just this ongoing direct commentary analysis as events unfold, basically. So that is not something that all audiences necessarily want, of course, either. But and you know, if you do follow this over time, then you'll see that the story might change, that there might be updates, there might be journalists saying, well, actually, we got that wrong, or it turns out this is not true. So drafts dismiss, stories change basically over the course of the day. But in some ways, of course, for audiences, this actually makes journalism more transparent, rather than the finished story where the journalist tells you this is all that's happened and this is how you need to interpret it. And essentially where you have to trust the journalists that they know what they're talking about, and they have the right kind of interpretation and framing for whatever's going on. In this, you can follow the event as it unfolds, and if the journalist kind of interprets it in some way, well, you can still have a different interpretation quite easily, because you've also seen the raw updates come in, essentially. So it makes the whole process much more transparent. But it is a lot more fragmented, obviously. So all of these different bits, events, reports, comments, witnesses' accounts, and the reporter somewhere in the middle as the intermediary and the moderator, basically, for this, who hopefully does a good job. And not, of course, all reporters do this well necessarily, of bringing all of this together and giving space to the different voices and the different versions of events, basically. So that's the challenge, and audiences again might find that overwhelming and challenging to follow. As Tereskevich says, this is really quite a hybrid genre in some ways, a hybrid form of reporting, because it's not just plain reporting. It might include interviews, it might include debate, it might include just plain reporting, yes, news stories that are embedded as links as well that you can follow, that might have a different take from the journalist who's curating the feed, whole feature articles, or sometimes just comments from the reporter, the journalist, the moderator, or also, of course, from the general public. So it's a whole mishmash of different types of genres, different types of bits put together, much again as you would see in a social media feed as well. And, you know, from some of the studies that have looked at this quite systematically, well, for one thing, these things are, of course, much longer than traditional news articles are, because you have potentially a full day of updates basically put together. So sometimes these things extend to tens of thousands of words ultimately over the course of the day. But then within that also, you get far more multimedia content, far more other forms of content embedded as well that than you would see in normal journalistic articles. So it's a much more colorful picture, I think, in some ways, of events as well, because it has all of these different elements and embeds and so on as well. And again, I've talked a little bit about linking out as well to other sources, which is not something that news outlets normally do. But in this case, it's a very deliberate strategy for saying, well, this really gives us a complete picture of the event. This gives you, as the reader, a complete picture of the event. And therefore, it informs you much better than just having to trust the journalist that they've consulted all the sources without actually being able to see those sources directly. So that's again a very different approach to all of this. And in part, actually, this is driven by the need to keep the thing ticking over as well. Similar in some ways to what you see in live 24-hour cable news broadcasts as well. Sometimes they just really have to fill dead air because they don't really quite know what's going on. They're waiting for something to happen. So all they can do is kind of talk amongst themselves and interpret what's going on and provide predictions about what's happening. In a live blog, it's not quite that, but you've got that space that you need to fill in order to keep the thing ticking over. So sometimes you need to embed social media or include other kind of content. And that's just the way it needs to happen, basically. So this is kind of part of the reason for including other stuff as well that isn't normally there. And so that also enables a different form of participation, of course, different form of engagement. So yeah, this really means ultimately that journalists are quite actively searching for material to include as well. They're not just waiting for news reports to come in from their reporters or from others that they follow, but they might also really go out and say, well, is there someone online who perhaps has an interesting take on what's going on, who is perhaps providing some eyewitness reporting on something or whatever else it might be, and is that something that I could include in the blog perhaps as well? And in some ways, because journalists, of course, have for quite some time felt the sort of pressure of social media. Who are we still if people are just going to social media to get their news updates? What is the role of the journalist in all of this? This is in some ways journalists kind of stepping in again and saying, well, with all of this really hard to navigate overwhelming amount of content that circulates on the social media platforms themselves, let us be the guide, let us filter through that for you and provide a much more condensed version of events as they happen live. So this is news media as well as journalists themselves establishing themselves in that new kind of media ecosystem, basically providing, positioning themselves in a different way from what they were before, essentially. And yeah, it really is a hybrid ultimately between the sort of social media logic, the bottom-up social media logic, and the top-down kind of publishing model of news media as it has existed for more than 100 years by now. But again, also for audiences, the problem is that because it's so live and so ongoing, and that there's such a need to follow events as they unfold, and as it's not really quite clear exactly what's going on yet, fact-checking, verification, and particularly timely, rapid fact-checking and verification is a real problem in this. And there's been plenty of examples of live blogs that have at times included misinformation, maybe even deliberate disinformation that others have spread, because it looked plausible and because it looked real. So that's a challenge. It's only a challenge that's going to get worse from here on in, because there's simply better tools to create really credible disinformation, deepfakes, and so on. We've seen this particularly, of course, in recent times with the live blogging and the reporting on the war in Ukraine, because their different sides of the conflict are of course, reporting their supposed victories, their supposed advances and so on, in a way that is not just designed to provide clear and direct and plain reporting, but also to influence morale on the other side. So, of course, in war, you will try and report your victories and hide your losses. So there too, it has become particularly difficult for journalists to verify what's actually going on the ground, because they're not usually on the ground in the middle of the war zone, of course. So in these kinds of cases, you often see in the live blogging as well as in other reporting, these kinds of disclaimers saying the Ukrainian side says this, the Russian side says this. We haven't been able to verify these, but essentially we're providing you with an update on what they've been saying so you can make up your own mind while we try to verify what's really going on the ground. And that's a really fundamental challenge, of course, particularly for this form of reporting, which has to happen so quickly as well in order to be a live blog. So that's what journalists have to confront. And this is Andrew Sparrow, who is one of these live bloggers, saying, well, if I get something really wrong, then I'll acknowledge that in the live blog as quickly as possible. I'll go back to the original post on live blog as well. I won't kind of just invisibly, correct it, but rather I will insert a correction in the post that says, look, I got this wrong. Here's what we found out subsequently was in fact the case. Because that also means that someone who looked at the earlier post might see it as well if they look at it again. So this is kind of a publish then verify model. Get it out first and then try and verify what you can. Interestingly enough, this really echoes very strongly what Clay Shirky, one of the early theorists of blogging, said about blogs, which is publish then filter. So publish first, then see what comments come in. And if those comments give you a different take on the story that corrects your own opinion, then acknowledge that and change your opinion, basically. So this is something that really happens in live blogging now. And again, something that live blogging has kind of inherited from other forms of blogging, that you might just put something out without knowing if it's fully true, with the appropriate caveats, and then try and correct and find the correct kind of interpretation later on. This is not something that comes easy to journalists, because journalists are very keen, of course, to get the correct information out as early as possible. So this is quite a leap of faith for many journalists as well, to work in this kind of way. So all of that can be very confusing, of course, both to journalists and to audiences. And these are some of the kind of negative ways of talking about it. This is, in fact, a response to the live blogging that happened after one of the major earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand in the early 2010s. So someone who really couldn't deal with that format, saying, well, there's no structure, there's no sense. The effect of it is being in the middle of a room full of loud, shouty and excitable people all yelling at once, with all the phones ringing, the fire alarm going off, and the drunken old boy slurring in your ear about what it all means. So this is kind of the reaction that some people do have, and maybe quite rightly have, to this format. There's just so much going on, much like social media itself, that it's hard to make heads or tails of it, to make sense of what's going on, and you might just be overwhelmed by the volume of stuff that comes through. So it's not something that really is particularly well suited to the casual news user who just wants the article that tells them this is what really happened here. It's something for much more involved, ongoing, heavy news users, I guess, for news junkies, in fact, in that sense. So it is just really difficult, unless you are a regular follower of the news, to follow it all. It's part of the journalistic task of curation, in fact, to try and take away some of that chaos and that overwhelming kind of aspect of all of this, by providing something that isn't just a maddening stream of consciousness, but is much more aggregated, much more coordinated as well. And that's the real challenge for live bloggers. And not every journalist turns out to be a good live blogger, even though they might be a good journalist. So it is a very particular journalistic skill that people have picked up. And so, the average reader may not easily navigate all of this, or the design even of the live blog, the user interface of the live blog, needs to be very carefully structured in order to make it accessible to the average reader as well. However, at the same time, it is a popular format. So many people, and perhaps people who have now become kind of used to the formats of social media as well, do use live blogs quite frequently. And as it says there from a few years back, news users are more than twice as likely to participate in live blogs compared to other article types. So it is quite an attractive format that people use and people come back to as well. And the interesting thing is, particularly, it's being used by professionals, by people who are sort of at work and have this perhaps on a side screen or on a sidebar somewhere, and just sort of come back to it from time to time to see the latest updates. Of course, for instance, if you're in business and you have the business live blog open, that's a perfect match in some ways. You can kind of monitor what else is going on in your world along the way, sort of on the side while you're doing your work. But for many others as well, following, let's say, daily politics while you're at work or whatever else it is in fact something that a lot of people are doing. So particularly if you actually are working at a computer, at work, at a desk, in the office, or maybe at home. A lot of people actually have this sort of on in the background and kind of come back to it from time to time. That's also, I think, one of the reasons that we've seen, in addition to the really event and topic focused live blogs, we've seen the emergence of these sort of through the day generic live blogs going on, like the business live blogs, even like the politics live blogs, that just sort of update readers on an ongoing basis about what's going on in the world. That's a little bit like being on social media again, like having your Twitter or your Facebook feed sort of on in the window somewhere, but with just journalists actually curating that for you rather than just seeing everyone's updates. So it's kind of the, if you like, the professional news version of a Facebook feed or a Twitter feed, as curated by journalists. That's why it's become quite popular. And that's really what's emerged is, again, not just live blogs that are focused on a particular topic, but that are focused on a generic newsbeat, like politics, like the economy, like sports, like entertainment. And that will just feed into this, any kind of major updates on those topics, on those beats. So this is what the Guardian one looks like, for instance, where you will get, and you see there just from the timeline at the top there, this is for the UK, so a new statement about the new Prime Minister, about the COP27 Climate Change Summit, Prime Minister's question time and the performance there, a verdict on that. The Prime Minister saying he regrets appointing a particular minister. Again, preparation for Prime Minister's question time, tributes for someone who's died, the Education Secretary lauding the new Prime Minister, and so on. So this is kind of just UK politics through the day, and it's just a rolling feed of updates, basically. So if you happen to be interested in UK politics, then this is a way that you can follow it sort of on the side as you're going about your daily work, whatever. And of course, you can come back to it from time to time and see that sort of update box there at the top as well. And that's, again, quite a few of the more progressively minded journalists and editors are saying this is maybe one of the ways that journalism will go more in the future. Alan Rusbridger, who's a former editor of The Guardian and happens to be a particularly sort of future-focused, I guess, journalism leader, said, well, if you can open up your site, if you can allow other voices in, you get something that's more engaged, more involved, and actually journalistically better as well. So this is about journalism opening up more to its audience, rather than just saying, we provide the finished product, you read it, and that's the amount of relationship we have. So this is much more connected in that sense. And Charlie Beckett, who's another one of these sort of progressively minded kind of people in this space, says the way it changes reporting is typical of network journalism. That's sort of a term that he's been pushing. It's a concentrated dose of participatory, interactive, connected news media, facilitated by a professional mainstream media journalist or team. And he even says it could become the new online front page. It could be the thing that is actually on the front page of news organizations' websites. And what I showed you, for instance, of The Guardian before, which had 3 different live blogs plus the midterm live blog on there, is actually an example of that. That there are these that there are a number of the leading news sites that are very prominently featuring live blogs now on their front page, and that's sort of what they think will attract readers to be there and to come back regularly as well. All right, so that's actually where I think we'll finish for today. So a little bit quicker perhaps than we usually go, but hopefully that's given you kind of an idea of why live blogs are in fact an interesting format in all of this as well. And it's really one of these cases of journalism trying to reinvent what it does for a new media and communicative environment. Next time we'll talk about another of these kinds of innovative kind of practices, and that's fact-checking. Fact-checking too is is a format, I guess, that has evolved over the last few years in response, of course, to what's been going on, which is the proliferation of mis and disinformation really around the world on any kinds of topics. And in recent times, of course, particularly also around COVID-19. Now, the report that I've given you to read for this is from the pre-COVID days, and it's from 2016. It focuses more on the rise of these fact-checking sites at that time, really around the events of Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. But in many ways, I think you'll see how that also has continued until now, to establish itself much more fundamentally around the world. What is interesting, I think, about this report is that they really talk to individual fact checkers around Europe, and there's also some very distinct differences across European countries in the way that fact checking has emerged, that is being run, what it checks, how it engages with the news and politicians and so on. So have a look at that for next time, and we'll talk about it more next week. So thank you, and we'll see you then.